Welcome back, After Darkers. This is Static After Dark, the podcast where we descend into the strange, the unexplained, and the downright bizarre stories that lurk in the shadows of history. I'm your host, Chris, and tonight, or rather this morning for those listening in the wee hours, we're diving headfirst into one of aviation's most perplexing cold cases. The disappearance of a Boeing 727 that vanished over the Atlantic Ocean in 2003 with 2 men aboard and absolutely no trace left behind. This isn't a case of a small plane disappearing over the wilderness. This is a commercial airliner, a massive aircraft, and it just evaporated. I'm talking about N844AA. A Boeing 727-223 that took off from an airport in Luanda, Angola on the evening of May 25, 2003 and was never seen again. Not a single piece of wreckage, not a signal, not a credible sighting in over 20 years, nothing. So settle in, get comfortable, and turn off those lights, because we're about to explore one of the most fascinating aviation mysteries of the 21st century. The background: a plane with baggage. Before we can understand how an aircraft this size vanishes, we need to understand how it got to Angola in the first place. And trust me, this backstory is just as strange as the disappearance itself. Let's rewind to the year 2000. A Boeing 727-223 with the tail number N844AA is being retired from American Airlines after 25 years of faithful service. This isn't some decrepit clunker. American Airlines had an impeccable maintenance program. The aircraft was in mint condition, nearly 70,000 flying hours in the air, and it was still performing beautifully. But aeroplanes, like people, reach an age where commercial carriers decide it's time to move on. And that's when things get complicated. The aircraft gets sold to a Florida-based company called Aerospace Sales and Leasing. Now, these guys did what many aircraft brokers do. They looked for markets where older commercial aircraft could find new life. And they found someone interested: operators wanting to set up cargo operations in Africa. By 2002, a South African entrepreneur named Keith Irwin, a former airline operator and IT company owner, gets involved. He's representing a joint venture with a company called Cargo Air Transport Systems, and they've won a lucrative contract to deliver fuel to diamond mines in Angola. It's extremely dangerous work. Angola had just come out of a brutal civil war, and delivering goods by road was nearly impossible. So you fly them in. Heavy fuel loads, unpaved runways, and active war zones just miles away. It's the kind of flying that keeps pilots up at night. Irwin arranges to lease a 727 with a full crew: pilot, first officer, flight engineer. And they're going to install massive fuel tanks inside the cabin. The plan is sound. The investor has put $450,000 down. Everything is in motion. But then, the deal falls apart. The company's supposed to take delivery pulls out. The arrangement collapses, and suddenly, you've got a pristine Boeing 727 that nobody wants, sitting in Angola with nobody sure who actually owns it anymore. Enter Maury Joseph, the president of Aerospace Sales and Leasing. Joseph decides to salvage the situation by selling the aircraft to Irwin for around $1 million. A down payment of $125,000 is made. The agreement is that Irwin will make the balance due within 30 days. But, and this is the critical part, Irwin's partners only make 2 payments before defaulting, completely. The aircraft is left at Quatro de Fevereiro Airport in Luanda, grounded and stuck. And here's where it gets really interesting. That aircraft starts accumulating fees: parking fees, landing fees, navigation fees, fuel charges, all the invisible costs that airports charge. And they stack up, month after month, year after year. By the time we get to May 2003, N844AA has been sitting on that tarmac for over 14 months. The unpaid fees? Over $4 million. $4 million. The aircraft is essentially a very expensive, very immobile paperweight. But it's not just a financial disaster, it's a legal nightmare. There are disputes over who owns it. Reports start circulating that the registration might have been changed to a fake number, 5N-RIR. The aircraft documentation is unclear. There are whispers that it's missing the HF radio required by international regulations. Some Angolan aviation officials even suggested there were irregularities with its certification from passenger to cargo conversion. Some rumors even suggested it was banned from overflying Angolan airspace. So by May 2003, you've got a complicated situation. A $500,000 aircraft with hundreds of thousands of dollars in accumulated fees, murky ownership, questionable documentation, and a ton of financial entities and individuals claiming various rights to it or its debts. In hindsight, it was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Enter the players. Ben Padilla's story. Now let's talk about the people involved. And we have to start with Ben Charles Padilla Jr. Ben was a Florida guy. The son of a millwright, he grew up with a passion for aviation and mechanics. From childhood, he was the kind of guy who understood how things worked. By his mid-20s, he'd learned to fly and become certified as an airframe and power plant mechanic, one of the highest certifications you can get in aviation maintenance. This isn't someone who randomly decided to become an aircraft mechanic. This was someone genuinely gifted with machines. By 2003, Ben was living in South Florida with his fiancée of 15 years and her children. The two never married, but she was central to his life. He gave her power of attorney and made her the executor of his estate. Everything he had would go to her. Now, Ben wasn't a commercial airline pilot. He had a private pilot's license. That's the basic level of certification. Not enough to fly a 727. But he was incredibly knowledgeable about aircraft systems, and he'd worked in Africa before. He'd done jobs for Maury Joseph, the same guy who owned N844AA. In fact, Padilla had helped Joseph ferry a 727 to Nigeria for a sale, and during that month-long trip, the two had become fairly close. Joseph described him as someone he trusted completely. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone had the same impression of Ben Padilla. Jeff Swain, a man in international aircraft sales, had hired Padilla to work as a flight engineer on an airline operation in Indonesia in the late 1990s, and then fired him. According to Swain, Padilla was undisciplined and too involved in chasing the local girls. After he was fired, Padilla allegedly stayed in Indonesia for 2 extra months, racking up a $10,000 hotel bill he claimed the airline would pay. The airline ended up having him deported. But here's where the story gets murkier. Padilla apparently showed Swain and others various photographs over the years. To Swain, he claimed he had a wife and children in Mozambique. Another friend supposedly saw a photograph of a wife in Tanzania. Someone else heard she was in Indonesia. Padilla's sister, Benita Padilla Kirkland, who's been instrumental in keeping his case alive, says her brother would have told her if he had another family. She doesn't deny the relationships, but she believes Ben was helping to support people he'd befriended. Maybe there were multiple situations. We don't know for certain. What we do know is that Ben Padilla was a complicated man, charismatic, well-traveled, someone who seemed to have stories and connections in places most of us only read about. In November 2002, Maury Joseph hired Ben Padilla for a specific mission: fly to Angola, pay the outstanding fines and airport fees, and hire mechanics to get N844AA back into flight-ready condition so it could be delivered to a new buyer who was waiting in Johannesburg, South Africa. Ben arrived in Angola in early 2003 and started working with Air Gemini, a local Luanda-based airline that had a repair station. He was methodical. He was making progress. The engines were being worked on. The aircraft was slowly returning to service. The other man, John Mikel Mutantu. Now we need to talk about the second person because this is where details start to get hazy. John Mikel Mutantu was his name. He was believed to be from the Republic of the Congo, though some reports said the Democratic Republic of Congo. Like Ben, he was not a pilot. Unlike Ben, He wasn't even technically qualified to be a flight engineer. He was a mechanic, a hired hand. And from what we can gather, he was working with Ben Padilla on the aircraft maintenance. Here's the problem. We don't know much about Mutantu. There's no detailed biography, no extensive record of his background. Most of what we know is that he was there, working with Ben, and that he disappeared with the aircraft. This is one of those details that makes you lean back and think, why don't we have more information about him? In a disappearance this famous, why is one of the two missing people so poorly documented in the public record? Was he just an innocent bystander? Or was there something about Mutantu's background, his connections, his reasons for being there that made him relevant to what actually happened? We may never know, but his absence from the historical record is itself noteworthy. The day it happened, May 25th, 2003, before sunset. Let's set the scene for May 25th, 2003. Quatro de Fevereiro Airport is one of the main airports serving Luanda, Angola's capital city. It's on the coast, in the west-central part of southern Africa, right there on the Atlantic. It's a functioning airport, but it's in a country that's just come out of a brutal civil war. It's not LAX. It's not perfectly organized. There's a certain, let's call it a flexibility to how things operate. On the morning of May 25th, Ben Padilla and presumably John Mutantu have made preparations. The 727 has been serviced. According to the plan, Padilla is going to conduct what's called an engine run-up. Essentially, they're going to taxi the aircraft out to the runway and run the engines up to full power to check all the systems before flight. That's standard procedure when an aircraft is being brought back to service. Everything is aligned for this to be a routine maintenance check. And then something changes. Late in the morning, Ben and John, or possibly just Ben, witnesses are unclear on this point, make their way to the aircraft. The aircraft is fueled. Reports suggest it had around 14,000 gallons. Some sources say 53,000 liters, which would give it a range of roughly 1,500 to 2,400 kilometers. That's anywhere from 800 to 1,500 miles. An airport employee reported seeing only one person board the aircraft. Other airport officials swear they saw two men board. We still don't have clarity on this point, nearly 25 years later. And here's where things go very wrong, very quickly. Shortly before sunset, the reports suggest around 5 p.m. local time, the 727 begins taxiing. But there's a problem. There's no communication with the control tower. The crew is supposed to check in, get clearance, follow procedures. None of that happens. The aircraft just starts moving. Eyewitnesses describe the movement as erratic. That's the word that keeps coming up in every account. Erratic. The 727 is maneuvering strangely, entering the runway without clearance. Imagine you're sitting in the tower, watching an aircraft that supposedly is doing a maintenance run suddenly start moving like something isn't right. Air traffic controllers try to make contact. N844AA. This is Luanda Tower. Please respond. Nothing. Radio silence. The only response they get is silence and the sight of a massive commercial aircraft moving across the tarmac in ways that don't make sense. The aircraft has no lights on. In the fading daylight of early evening, this is significant. Why would you turn off the lights if you are conducting a routine engine run-up? Lights help maintain situational awareness. They're required for safety. Turning them off is a deliberate choice. More disturbing, the transponder isn't transmitting. The transponder is the system that tells air traffic control and other aircraft where you are, how high you're flying, and who you are. It's like turning off the GPS on your phone so nobody can track you. Again, this is a deliberate action. Someone inside that cockpit made the conscious decision to disable the transponder. The 727 reaches the runway without clearance. And then it does something extraordinary. It takes off. A massive commercial aircraft, piloted by someone with only a private pilot's license, if indeed it was piloted by one of the two men aboard, with the lights off and the transponder disabled, launches itself into the sky, and it immediately turns southwest, heading out over the Atlantic Ocean. According to accounts from that day, witnesses described watching the aircraft disappear into the distance, heading southwest over the water. And from that moment on, despite decades of searching, despite the involvement of the FBI, CIA, NSA, Department of Homeland Security, CENTCOM, and aviation authorities across multiple continents, nobody has ever seen N844AA again. The immediate aftermath, a global security alert. When Maury Joseph found out the aircraft was missing, his first reaction was confusion. He was expecting a phone call from Air Gemini telling him the aircraft was leaving for Johannesburg. Instead, he got an angry demand. Why did another crew fly the aeroplane out of Luanda? Joseph's response was immediate. He called the US Embassy in South Africa and reported the aircraft as stolen. Then he called his wife back in Florida and told her to call the FBI. What happened next was extraordinary. Within hours, the US Department of State had sent messages to every American embassy in Africa. Every single one. The message was clear. An airliner has been stolen. Call every airport with a runway long enough to handle a 727. Find it. And here's why this mattered so much. The date was May 25, 2003. That was less than 2 years after September 11th. The wounds from 9/11 were still raw. The intelligence community was hypervigilant about aircraft, about terrorism, about flying bombs. And now, a missing 727 with long-range capabilities, pilots of unknown allegiance, and no communication was missing somewhere over Africa. Retired U.S. Marine General Mastin Robeson was the commander of U.S. forces in the Horn of Africa at the time. He's spoken about how the 727 came up through the intelligence network. According to Robeson, CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, was actually considering moving U.S. fighter aircraft to Djibouti on the Red Sea coast, where they shared a base with the French military. The explicit reason was to track down or intercept the missing aircraft potentially. Think about that for a second. The U.S. military was preparing to potentially shoot down a missing passenger aircraft because it couldn't rule out that it was a terrorist threat. Robeson himself described the uncertainty. It was never clear whether it was stolen for insurance purposes by the owners or whether it was stolen with the intent to make it available to unsavory characters or whether it was a deliberate concerted terrorist attempt. There was speculation of all three. The 727 had been converted to carry diesel fuel. It had multiple 500-gallon fuel tanks in the cabin. An aircraft full of fuel could be used as an improvised weapon. You could fly it into a building, a power plant, a government facility, or a military installation. Less than 2 years after 9/11, no one could rule anything out. So for weeks, possibly months, the US intelligence apparatus was in overdrive. Satellites were being tasked to look for signs of a crash. Every airport in Africa was being monitored for any sign of the aircraft landing. Intelligence was being shared with allied nations. The hunt was on. And then, something changed. The speculation about terrorism ended. We don't know exactly why. Maybe satellite imagery showed debris in the Atlantic. Maybe intelligence sources learned something that ruled out the terrorist scenario. Maybe search efforts turned up nothing and officials simply moved on to other priorities. But here's the thing. That explanation has never been officially released. The CIA won't comment. The FBI won't comment. Even the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the people who run the spy satellites, won't confirm or deny what they found or didn't find. In 2005, about 2 years after the disappearance, the FBI closed its case. They closed it without finding the aircraft, without identifying the pilots conclusively, and without determining what happened. The theories. Where did N844AA go? So what actually happened to N844AA? After more than 2 decades with all the investigative journalism, All the conspiracy theories, all the speculation, we still have no definitive answer. But we have theories. Let me walk you through the major ones. Theory 1. The Atlantic crash. This is probably the most widely accepted explanation among aviation experts and former pilots who've looked into the case. The theory is straightforward. Ben Padilla took the controls, or someone else did, and immediately realized they were in over their head. A 727 is a complex aircraft. Even if Padilla understood the systems intellectually, flying one requires training Padilla didn't have. The aircraft took off erratically, climbed over the ocean, and either crashed shortly after takeoff due to pilot error or structural problems, or ran out of fuel and went down in the Atlantic somewhere. The Atlantic Ocean is vast. If the aircraft went down in deep ocean water, particularly at night or in bad weather, the wreckage could easily be missed. Ocean currents would disperse debris. The transponder being off means search and rescue teams didn't have a last known position. In a massive body of water with limited search resources, finding wreckage is incredibly difficult. This theory is supported by Padilla's sister Benita as one possibility, and it's accepted as plausible by most people who knew Padilla or worked on the aircraft. Theory 2. Insurance fraud. This is the theory that US intelligence officials apparently considered seriously. The scenario is that someone associated with the aircraft, possibly Maury Joseph, the owner, orchestrated the theft and disappearance to collect insurance money. The aircraft had been sitting on the tarmac for over a year, accumulating costs. It was worthless as an operational aircraft, but as an insured asset destroyed by theft and crash, it might be worth money. What makes this theory interesting is Joseph's history. In the 1990s, Joseph was the CEO of a cargo airline called Florida West, which went bankrupt. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, actually charged Joseph in a civil case with falsifying financial statements and defrauding investors. He was fined and barred from serving as an officer in a publicly held company. So when intelligence officials heard that Joseph's 727 had disappeared, they had to consider whether this looked like a repeat performance. However, Joseph voluntarily submitted to a lie detector test, and Jeff Swain, who was with Joseph when he got the call about the aircraft being missing, has consistently said that Joseph appeared genuinely shocked and confused. "Look, nobody was more amazed by this situation than Maury," Swain said. Ben Padilla's brother, Joe, is adamant on this point. He says if anyone suggests his brother was involved in insurance fraud, they're full of it because he knows his brother, and he's not going to do nothing crooked. I know that for a fact. The insurance fraud theory doesn't have a lot of evidence supporting it, and it requires assuming Joseph was willing to risk two men's lives on an elaborate scheme. It's possible, but it feels increasingly unlikely the more you examine it. Theory 3. Clandestine operations. This is where things get more speculative. The theory is that the 727 was stolen for use in illegal cargo operations, drugs, weapons, prohibited goods moving between African nations, or being smuggled to other continents. The aircraft had range. It could carry significant cargo. If someone was already going to steal it, they might as well use it for something profitable. This scenario would explain why the transponder was off. You don't want to be tracked. It would explain the erratic taxiing. Possibly people unfamiliar with the aircraft were trying to get it airborne quickly. It would explain why there's been no trace, no debris, no evidence. If the aircraft was dismantled for parts or flown to a remote location, you wouldn't necessarily have wreckage. One of the theories that circulated is that the aircraft was disassembled for parts in Bujumbura, Burundi, on Tanzania's western border. Another variation suggests it went north and vanished near Kinshasa, Congo. A Luandan pilot claimed he heard through local aviation circles that the aircraft went north into Central Africa. If these theories have any truth, it means the aircraft was landed somewhere, likely on an unpaved runway in Africa, and was then broken down or hidden. It would require a significant operation. You don't hide a 727 without serious resources and local cooperation. Theory 4. Government operations. And then there are the more speculative theories. What if the 727 wasn't stolen at all, but was deliberately taken by a government agency or military entity for purposes that were never made public? What if intelligence agencies let it disappear intentionally? This might explain why the terrorism concerns were dropped so suddenly, why the case was closed in 2005 without explanation, why requests for information under the Freedom of Information Act have been denied or heavily redacted. Now, I'm not saying this is true, but I'm saying the possibility exists given how the case was handled. If the aircraft landed at a military base somewhere, if it was used for classified purposes, if intelligence agencies knew what happened but couldn't publicly acknowledge it, well, we'd never find out. Theory 5. Personal escape. Another theory, less discussed but occasionally mentioned, is that one or both of the men aboard deliberately stole the aircraft to escape. Maybe Padilla was in debt. Maybe he had complicated personal situations in the United States that he was fleeing from. Maybe Mutantu wanted to get out of Africa and saw the stolen aircraft as an opportunity. They get the plane in the air, fly somewhere, and start new lives using false identities. This theory has problems. Where would you go? How would you avoid detection for decades? The aircraft would need to be hidden or dismantled. Money would need to materialize from somewhere. It's a romantic notion, but practically speaking, it's difficult to execute and maintain. Theory 6. Foul play and unknown third parties. There's Joe Padilla's theory, Ben's younger brother. He's convinced that more than one person was already on board the aircraft waiting. He believes Ben and John Mutantu were forced to take the aircraft into the air by people already hiding inside it. And he believes those individuals forcibly took control of the aircraft once it was airborne, then killed Ben and Mutantu. This would explain why witnesses were confused about whether one or two men boarded the aircraft. If there were already people inside, it might have looked like just one or two people boarding. It would explain the erratic taxiing if there was a struggle for control of the aircraft. It would explain why there's been absolutely no trace if the aircraft landed somewhere and those responsible dismantled it or disposed of it. The problem with this theory is the evidence. Without eyewitness testimony, communication records, or any other physical evidence, it remains just a possibility. The sightings, ghost planes, and false leads. Now, here's something interesting. There have been reported sightings of N844AA after its disappearance. The most famous was in July 2003, about 6 weeks after the aircraft went missing. A sighting was reported in Conakry, Guinea. Conakry is on the west coast of Africa, and from the route N844AA would have flown out of Luanda. It would have been in the general direction the aircraft could have traveled. Suddenly, there was hope. Maybe the aircraft had landed. Maybe someone had seen it. But almost immediately, the US State Department conclusively dismissed the sighting. No official explanation for why it was dismissed. Just dismissed. Gone. The possibility closed off. Over the years, various other sightings and rumors have circulated. A pilot in Luanda claimed to hear that the aircraft went north and vanished near Kinshasa. An acquaintance of Ben Padilla claimed that aviation sources told him the aircraft had been disassembled for parts in Bujumbura, Burundi. These are third-hand accounts, rumor and hearsay, but they're part of the history of this case. What's notable is that none of these has been confirmed, and all of them can be easily dismissed. They're the kind of rumors that spread in tight-knit aviation communities or in international circles in Africa, where accurate information is sometimes hard to come by, and speculation fills the gaps. The people left behind. Benita Padilla Kirkland's Search for Answers. If you want to understand the human cost of this mystery, you need to know about Benita Padilla Kirkland. She's Ben Padilla's sister, and for more than 20 years, she's been trying to get the FBI to properly investigate her brother's disappearance. In 2004, just a year after Ben disappeared, Benita spoke with the South Florida Sun-Sentinel about her family's situation. She said her family suspected her brother had been flying the aircraft and that he either crashed somewhere in Africa or was being held against his will. These weren't wild theories. These were reasonable possibilities from someone who knew Ben intimately. But by 2010, 7 years after the disappearance, Benita was in a different place. She was trying to convince the FBI to reopen the case. She said she had new information, and she believed the agency already had more information than agents were willing to admit to. The new information she passed along to the FBI was a possible sighting of the aircraft, one of many reported over the years. But the core issue was frustration. Her brother had disappeared. The FBI had investigated. The case had been closed. But there were no answers. No body, no aircraft, no definitive explanation. For the people left behind, Ben's fiancée, his sister, his other family members, the lack of closure must be agonizing. They don't know if Ben is dead or alive. They don't know if he crashed into the Atlantic or if he's somehow living under an assumed identity somewhere. They don't have a grave to visit. They don't have an explanation they can give to people who ask, "So what happened to your brother?" They just have questions and silence. This is one of the most human aspects of the N844AA story. Behind the mystery, behind the speculation, behind the theories about insurance fraud or terrorism or clandestine operations, there are real people who lost someone. Why this matters? The largest aircraft ever to disappear, N844AA, holds a specific distinction. It is the largest aircraft ever to disappear without a trace. We're not talking about a small Cessna that went down over wilderness. We're not talking about a remote bush plane. This is a commercial-grade Boeing 727. This is an aircraft with a 153-foot wingspan. An aircraft that weighs 95,000 pounds empty. An aircraft that, if you were standing next to it, would tower above you like a 4-story building. And yet it vanished. Now Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared in 2014 with 239 people on board over the Indian Ocean. That's one of the most famous aviation mysteries in history. But at least with MH370, investigators found a part of the fuselage washed up on a beach. With N844AA, nothing. The question of how a 727 can just disappear raises fundamental questions about what we know about global aviation surveillance, about the dark areas of our planet where aircraft can hide, and about what intelligence agencies might know but aren't telling us. If you can disappear a 727 in 2003, fully intact and virtually undetectable, what does that mean for aviation security? What does it mean about the monitoring systems we rely on? If this happened in 2003, could it happen again today? In fact, it did happen again, but not with quite the same result. In 2018, there was an incident at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport where a commercial pilot stole a Bombardier Dash 8Q400 and took off without authorization. But that aircraft crashed on Ketron Island, so there was wreckage, there was a scene, there was closure of a sort. With N844AA, there's nothing like that. The investigation files, secrets and sealed records. Here's something that stands out to me as interesting and maybe a little troubling. The official investigation into N844AA was conducted across multiple agencies: FBI, CIA, NSA, Department of Homeland Security, CENTCOM. But very little of that investigation has ever been made public. When Smithsonian Magazine did an extensive article in September 2010, 7 years after the disappearance, the author, Tim Wright, interviewed numerous people involved in the case and did substantial research. But even after all that work, he couldn't draw any definitive conclusions. He concluded, "I have filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the CIA and FBI, and have followed in at least some of the FBI's footsteps, interviewing the people who flew 844AA to Angola and worked with it there, hoping to understand how a 727 could just disappear." But the agencies wouldn't comment. The CIA declined to comment. The FBI cited national security concerns and refused to comment. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the people who operate the spy satellites that would have been tasked to search for the aircraft, also refused to comment. What this tells us is that there's information about this case that the US government knows but is not sharing. Whether that information proves the aircraft crashed and sank, whether it shows the aircraft landed somewhere, or whether it contains classified information about what happened to it, we don't know. But the level of secrecy, even more than 2 decades later, is notable. In a normal missing persons or missing aircraft case in the United States, the investigation would be documented, and eventually those documents would become available. With N844AA, we get almost nothing. It's classified, it's sealed, it's beyond FOIA requests. That secrecy is, in itself, part of the mystery, a strange journey before the disappearance. The chaos of Angola. Let me take you back to tell you about some of the chaos that led up to the disappearance, because the aircraft's history in Angola was genuinely wild. When N844AA first arrived in Angola in March 2002 with the crew that Keith Irwin had assembled, things were supposed to be straightforward. The aircraft would be delivered. The company Quatro de Fevereiro would pay $220,000. The aircraft would begin fuel delivery missions to diamond mines. Simple. Except it wasn't simple at all. Quatro de Fevereiro didn't have the money, or they wouldn't pay. Depending on who you ask, one of these was true. The result was the same. The crew was stuck in Angola, in inadequate housing, without the money they'd been promised, and unable to leave because their passports had been confiscated. One of the flight engineers, Art Powell, described it vividly. "I was scared to death. I really thought I was going to die." Eventually, US Embassy intervention got the passports returned, but the situation became increasingly tense. Crew members were talking about stealing the aircraft to escape. There was an armed guard with an AK-47. The environment was genuinely dangerous. One crew member described the work they were doing as the most dangerous flying in the world. Flying fuel deliveries to remote, unpaved runways in a post-war zone is not safe aviation. At one point, another 727 from a competing company crashed on landing at one of these airstrips, skidded off the runway, and killed some local residents. The N844AA crew gave the other flight crew a lift out of there, but not before going over to their airplane and stealing some parts that we needed, according to one account. Eventually, the American crews abandoned the project. By late April 2002, all of the American crew members, except Mike Gabriel, had left. The situation had become too dangerous, the pay was insufficient, and the entire enterprise was falling apart. Keith Irwin himself became increasingly paranoid. He described being followed by a local man named Antonio, who he believed was working for one of his competitors, or the Angolan government. One night, someone used a key card to try to unlock his hotel room. Irwin had wedged a chair under the door handle, heard the lock release, and started yelling. "Whoever it was ran," he said. I started yelling, and whoever it was ran. The next day, Irwin left Angola. He never went back. By May 2002, the only thing left of the whole enterprise was the 727 itself, sitting at Quatro de Fevereiro Airport, accumulating fees and gathering dust. The enduring questions. What remains unsolved? As we wrap up this deep dive, let me leave you with the questions that remain unanswered, because they're the ones that keep investigators and aviation enthusiasts thinking about this case. Question 1. Who was flying the aircraft? Ben Padilla had a private pilot's license, which is not sufficient to operate a 727. So either Padilla made an incredibly desperate decision and somehow got the aircraft airborne, or someone else was aboard who had the qualifications to fly it. But no one else has ever been publicly identified as potentially being on board. Question 2. Was it deliberate or accidental? Was the takeoff planned and executed with purpose? Or did something go wrong during the engine run-up that caused the aircraft to become airborne unexpectedly? The erratic taxiing suggests something wasn't normal, but was it piloting inexperience or something else? Question 3. Why disable the transponder? This action requires intention. You don't accidentally turn off a transponder. Someone inside the cockpit deliberately did this. Why? Because they didn't want to be tracked. But for what purpose? Question 4. What happened after takeoff? Did the aircraft crash into the Atlantic? Did it land somewhere? Was it deliberately ditched in the ocean? Did it encounter catastrophic mechanical failure? Did it make it to Africa and land on a remote airstrip? Question 5. What do the intelligence agencies know? The fact that this case was investigated by the FBI, CIA, NSA, and CENTCOM, then closed in 2005 with no public explanation, suggests these agencies either found something conclusive, like crash debris, or found something they couldn't publicly acknowledge. What is it? Question 6. What happened to the men aboard? Are Ben Padilla and John Mutantu dead? If so, where are their remains? Are they alive somewhere? Are they imprisoned, hiding, living under false identities? For the people who love them, this question is agonizing. Question 7. Could it happen again? What does N844AA's disappearance tell us about the gaps in global aviation surveillance? Could someone steal another large aircraft today and have it disappear as completely? The security protocols have improved since 2003, but have they improved enough? Final thoughts. A mystery that won't go away. The mystery of N844AA has captivated aviation enthusiasts, conspiracy theorists, researchers, and the general public for more than 2 decades. Books have been written about it. Podcasts have covered it. Internet forums have debated it endlessly. And with each passing year, as the case grows older, the mystery seems to deepen rather than resolve. The most likely explanation, in the eyes of most experts, remains the simplest. The aircraft crashed into the Atlantic Ocean shortly after takeoff, piloted by someone without the experience to safely operate it. Padilla might have believed he could get it to South Africa. The aircraft might have suffered a mechanical failure. The weather might have been a factor. Pilot error is almost certain. And then, in the vastness of the Atlantic, the aircraft went down, broke apart, and the wreckage sank into depths where it's unlikely ever to be found. This explanation is supported by physics, by the known limitations of the aircraft, by the qualification levels of the men aboard, and by the practical realities of accident investigation. But it doesn't answer every question. It doesn't explain why someone turned off the transponder if this was all spontaneous. It doesn't explain the erratic taxiing. It doesn't explain the strange circumstances that led to the takeoff in the first place. And it doesn't provide closure for the people who loved Ben Padilla and John Mutantu. What we're left with is a mystery that's entered the permanent record of aviation history. A mystery that reminds us of how large our world still is, how many places are still beyond our surveillance, how much can still happen that we never find out about. N844AA is a ghost plane. It took off into the sunset on May 25, 2003, and it became legend. Well, After Darkers, thank you for joining me for this deep dive into the mystery of N844AA. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with fellow mystery enthusiasts. Leave a review. Tell your friends about Static After Dark. And if you have information about this case, or if you've heard theories we haven't covered, reach out on our website staticafterdark.com. This case remains officially unsolved, and after more than 2 decades, the fate of the Boeing 727N844AA and the men aboard it remains one of aviation's most profound mysteries. Until next time, After Darkers, keep asking questions, keep seeking answers, and keep looking into the darkness. This has been Static After Dark.